We move on to the second talk, and that's a talk by Michael Cochet from the VU University. He is the lab manager of the Elsevier Discovery Lab, and he's going to talk to us about driving scientific discovery through machine intelligence. So if you're ready, Michael, can you try and share your screen?
Hi, Martin.
So let's give it a shot. Loading. There we go. So if you're ready, Michael, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Martin. Hi, good evening, everyone. So I will be talking about the driving of scientific discovery through machine intelligence. So I'm talking in the name of the Elsevier Discovery Lab. And so I'm Michael Cochet. I'm the Discovery Lab academic manager, but I'm also an assistant professor in knowledge representation and reasoning at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. So today we'll be giving a bit of a, let's say, less technical talk as I usually do. So I will be talking a bit more about the type of topics which we work on in the lab, and I'll talk also a bit about how we work in the lab. So first of all, what is the Discovery Lab, which I'm talking about? So well, the focus of the lab is really on working on research services and knowledge graphs, right? And so the idea is to make research easier. So assisting researchers in discovering new insights and on evaluating research which is existing. So the context in which we work is that of a virtual research assistant, right? So we have basically the setting where you would have an assistant which can help you with certain questions or even help you generate certain hypotheses, tell you what kind of things might be interesting to in your particular research. And ultimately, the vision which we are having is that this assistant could be sort of a co-author on a scientific work. Now, so our mission is to accelerate research intelligence, basically to be able to make that research assistant through certain advancements. So we have to focus on some particular parts, and the ones which we focus on is knowledge representation, machine learning, natural language processing, and information retrieval. The people working on this, so there's a collaboration between, on the one hand, the two universities in Amsterdam and Elsevier. And at the university, we have 3 PhD students and 2 postdocs working on this. And we are working very closely together with various data science teams in Elsevier. Regarding our timelines, so we are now in the 2nd year of the lab. So now by now we have all people basically started. The total duration is 5 years, so we are, let's say, still a bit away from being halfway. Okay, so the idea of the lab is really to, as I said on the slide, being a catalyst for innovation, is really to have a lot of collaboration between what is happening in the company and what is happening in the research field, and basically be beneficial for both sides, for the university and for the company as well. So how do we do that? Well, we discuss a lot with people in the company. We talk a lot about ideas which we're having research-wise or business-wise. And we see basically, or we make sure, I would rather say, that these are matching well. Right? So we would never work on a topic which is only interesting for the business side or only really interesting for the university side. So we really want to find the parts where the academic interest and the business interests are meeting. And then we typically have sort of, well, let's say it's more of an internal how this workflow exactly works. It's not that important. Basically means we have a sort of way on how we make sure that these topics are interesting. So we work on them for a while, basically, and then we have a couple of stages in which we decide whether we continue working on them. One important part of this is what is here written as a co-location. Obviously, in the last couple of years, we couldn't really do that, the physical co-location, but now more and more we start working also physically together, that we will be visiting Elsevier offices together with all the students and so on. Okay, so in the lab, we work on several large challenges, right? So we have these 5 challenges which are written here, and I will go into more detail on them soon. And then there are certain things which we want to achieve with it. Now, before going into these 5 challenges which we're looking at, I want to first maybe talk a bit about the context in which we work. And one of them is that we have a real challenge with data. So one of them is, so most of you probably know that Elsevier is a publisher, right? So what they have is a lot of papers are being published, and the rate at which papers are being published is just increasing. It's just accelerating. And that means we currently have a situation where we have like millions of papers every year coming out. So the graph which is here is very tiny, but this has something like 1 million papers, but it's only specifically in medicine. There's a lot more if you look at all fields. And so this is just a lot of data. Now, the thing is that Elsevier is not only working on publications, actually, they are actually more like a data company. So they work on a lot of other types of data as well. They also have a lot of products related to other data sets which they have. And so also in other places, we see that the volume of this data is just growing a lot. Besides this size argument, there is also a thing that the data is just not properly linked up, or not just existing in one place. So here's just the separation between external and internal data, and then unstructured and structured data. So we just have data in all kinds of places, and for some use cases, you need to be able to take parts and pieces from these different sources. And the final challenge which we have is that, and there's maybe a slight critique on machine learning research, is that in most machine learning research, we are making an assumption that the data is very clean. We get a data set, we download the data set, it is labeled, we just run our machine learning algorithm, and we're sort of happy with the outcome. Once you move to reality, then you notice that real data sets are not like that. Yeah, so real data sets are just not as clean, not as heterogeneous, not as nice as you would like them to be. And that also means that when you're applying methods which you have first tested in your, let's say, more academic machine learning setting, they will just not work in the actual business setting or in the actual industry setting. So there's a quote here of let's say, a CEO of a large pharmaceutical company. So basically he said it like this, so that the first thing we've learned is the importance of having outstanding data, and people underestimate how little clean data there is out there and how hard it is to clean and link the data. And so that's really one of the things which Elsevier is working a lot of. It's just cleaning and linking data is really one of the large activities they do, and then actually providing this to other companies. Okay, so let's go back to the challenges which I was already referring to. So the first challenge which we are looking into is what we call reinforcement learning over structured multimodal information. And the way you can think of this is that we currently have most reinforcement learning tasks. Their data is rather, let me put it, rather simple, right? So it's typically very it's also structured, but it's sort of just a vector of numbers or something like this, or just a location, or just, it typically doesn't contain a lot of information, for example, like images or video and things like that. So, and that's something which we want to look into. It's basically also using what we call multimodal information. So it's a large graph which contains video, text, graphs, and all kind of other sources. Okay, and so what we want to do is also going a bit further with the recommendation part, right? So we want to know a bit more about, or we want to basically augment the recommendation by using information from this knowledge graph and from other sources. So this would also help a lot with what people would call a sort of cold start probe. Okay, so finally we want to have that recommendation service. Now this was the first general challenge which we had, and what we noticed is that one of the specific cases, that's where we contextualize to what is worked on Elsevier. It's one concrete case where they have a problem is reviewer recommendations. Right, so what they have at Elsevier, so they have thousands of reviews per day. Right, so there's a lot of papers are being published, so there's also a lot of reviewer activity. And so what they have internally is a review recommendation system. So if you're an editor of a journal, right, so that means basically it's somebody who is responsible for what comes into the journal, you have to find reviewers for scientific publications. And so what you have to do is find those people. And currently the way this works is that people are basically recommended based on their past activity and papers they have published. And the issue is that we have very limited understanding about well, fairness and bias in the system. There was a lot of discussion already in the previous talk about this, and this is exactly a case where this is also happening. So we just don't know things. There is actually, by now we have investigated it, and we know that there are certain biases. So some examples are here listed among the challenges. So we know that there's definitely bias towards certain geographic regions. We also noticed in some cases that there is a bias towards having reviewers from the same institute or people who have worked with people before, even though that shouldn't really happen. And so what we're currently working on is towards just having this less biased recommendation system. Okay, so this was this first challenge. We have a second challenge, is task-based question answering. And here the whole goal of this challenge is basically that we can answer questions more contextualized to what the user expects. So to take the example of the slide, so we, for example, have this question, what is aspirin? Right? So you ask this question from a system, what is aspirin? And you have two possible answers. So the first answer is it's a painkiller. And the second answer is basically it's a certain chemical compound. And the problem is that both answers are right. So both of these answers are correct answers to the question, what is aspirin? So deciding which of these two answers is best just depends on who is asking the question and why they're asking the question, right? So obviously you wouldn't ask maybe what is aspirin, but you can imagine this question to be much more complex. And then in that case, you would also have to decide what kind of answers do you want to give. So the challenge is really here to somehow encode or use more contextual information about who is asking and why are they asking this question. And so basically as a result, we want to have this question answering service, preferably natural language, just with free-form questions, which can give answers in a certain context of a research task. Okay, going one step further. So again, in this context of this research assistant, which can help you with your research, we want to do a task which is called hypothesis generation. So the idea there is that we have a lot of knowledge already. Right? So we know, we work a lot on biomedical cases in this particular challenge. So you know, for example, that certain drugs cure certain diseases, or we know that certain proteins are involved in certain in certain functions of certain medicines and so on. Now, what we want to do is that we want to be able to have a system which can suggest you new things to investigate. Right? So, for example, it should be able to tell you, like, hey, how about looking at this particular medicine for this particular disease? It is quite likely that it's a good candidate. And so the idea is that we can then also go from what's called a micro hypothesis, which is just a very, very tiny piece of information, right, to a much larger piece of information. So when I say, like, this medicine would be useful for this disease, this is already a very high level thing. Because if you go to the lower level, you will see that a certain medicine might have an impact on a certain protein, which affects another protein, which affects another one, which affects another chemical, which has a certain effect on this. And this would be a very large sort of path which you have to walk. So we want to go from these micro pieces to a much higher level complex hypothesis. Okay, so then that's what. Then we go to challenge number 4, right? So we want to go to knowledge-driven query construction. Okay, and so there the point is basically that we, again, it's much related to challenge 2 and 3, that we want to be able to help a researcher to formulate even just the question they want to ask. Right? So it's often said that asking the question is harder than answering it, and that's exactly where we want to help. So we want to be able to help a researcher construct the query which they want to ask. And that's, I think, very shortly summarizing what this whole challenge is about. Right? Okay, so then we move on to challenge number 5. So Martin, how much time do I have left? I just noticed you're joining the 5 minutes. Okay, yes, thank you. Yeah, challenge number 5, which is about knowledge graph construction. So a lot of the work which we're doing is so in the other challenges as well, is based on the fact that we have a large structured, or at least semi-structured source of information. And this source in our work is typically a knowledge graph. So this structure contains a lot of things, a lot of entities, and relations between these entities. So how are things related to each other? The thing is just that this knowledge graph doesn't exist to start with, right? It's not something we can just take off the shelf and then do the other tasks. What we need to do first is actually create this thing. So we need to, we need to create them. Then what we have as an input basically is a corpus of research papers. So we have a lot of research literature. We have a partial knowledge graph. So some of these graphs have already been manually constructed or constructed from indeed other sources of information. And we want to basically improve this task, or we want to basically make improvements on this construction task. So a lot of work has already been done. So we are working on specific parts of it. And one of them is we're trying to improve entity linking, especially when we have a low amount of information. It's basically, it's called the long tail problem. So you would have certain things which are only mentioned very few times in your text, and we still want to have a proper knowledge of these in the graph. The other one is link prediction. So basically means you have this large graph of information, and we want to find out links between two things which are in that graph. Right? So we want to, for example, figure out that a certain protein interacts with another protein. So this would be just one link between these two proteins. And as I said, so the biggest challenge is to do these things, one, in real time, right? Because we have thousands of papers coming in per day, like about 2,000 to 3,000 papers we have each day coming in. The other thing is that we have limited training data. So for some of these long tail entities, we have very few sources. Okay, so finally what we have is then a graph updating service. Basically, we can have this stream of scientific literature coming in, and on the other hand, we basically have this high quality knowledge graph. And with high precision alerts, meaning that you can also basically query this thing. So I would like maybe to just still take 1 minute to explain an example where we work on, so we don't work on these challenges in isolation. So typically we work on things which cover multiple aspects of them at the same time. So one of them is, so we have here this challenge 3, 4, and 5. And one of the things which are there working on is, for example, approximate query answering, right? So all of these things basically need a thing where you have a graph. So that's this thing here. So we take literature, we have constructed some graph here. And now this graph itself is going to be incomplete because first, just because we don't know everything, and secondly, because we cannot extract everything properly, which also attributes to this graph containing a lot of noise. So when we have that graph, we still want to be able to find all correct answers from it. And so what we do is we work on things like graph completion methods, where basically, if imagine a link is missing between these two things, so we basically complete it. So we try to find these missing links. And the second thing which we try to do is methods for approximate answering. So basically it means if you're asking a question for a query, and some parts of information in the graph are missing to answer that query, we will still try to find you the correct answers. So basically it means that we sort of on the fly try to complete the graph and detect certain certain noise or errors in the graph. Okay, so with this I like to end the presentation, but I still want to quickly mention, so we have so this lab is really a collaboration between indeed Elsevier, as I mentioned, but also several groups at the two universities in Amsterdam. It's an ICAI lab, and of course we're also working a lot together with ADS. And finally, we have a couple of international collaborations going on in the lab as well. And then I would like to take any questions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael. There is a question by TX. TX asks, might it be who is asking the question and how come that person role user is asking instead of the more philosophical why?
Yes. Yeah, I think okay, let me just get back to the context of that question. So it's really the start-based question answering. So it's a bit of both, right? So I think I understand the point. So it's indeed who is asking, but it's also why. So imagine. So I'm also okay. I have really two roles at university, right? So one is I'm a researcher, and the second one is I'm a teacher. Okay, I don't see them as very separate roles, but still there are two roles. And imagine that I'm looking up basically what a neural network is. Okay, so as a researcher, I will want a very different answer than when I'm searching in the sort of capacity of a teacher who's looking basically for teaching materials for slides, let's say, to explain what neural networks are, right? So sort of depending on which task you're performing at a certain point, you still want to have different answers. And so I can give a concrete example at Elsevier. So Elsevier is selling a specific product which is used for emergency rooms, right? So that means you have basically a hospital, they have an emergency situation, they have certain symptoms which they can observe in the patient. And at that point, they're using a system to find out what the person might have. And what they're basically working on is really figuring out whether this person who is searching is at that point like how big is the emergency, right? So is that just somebody who is generally browsing and looking for information about specific symptoms, or is it really such that there is a person currently dying? So it's not just about who is searching, but it's really we want to sometimes know why they're searching. And so in the case which I'm now talking about with this hospital case, it's sometimes just a matter of asking, like, is this an emergency? Yes, no, and then immediately give a specific answer. So there we have a sort of, let's say, a certain fixed number of options which we could have about the why. But in general, I would say the why is as important as the who is asking.
Okay, and even I guess you can make those distinctions even more fine-grained. For instance, the researcher might be sort of at a very early exploratory stage, finding out what's going on in an area, versus at the late stage looking for once he or she has their experimental outcomes, seeing whether they align with their experimental outcomes in the literature, or even so seeking backup material from the related work. And so I can imagine that there's quite a bit of work also planned for this challenge to model tasks, or is that how do you envisage that?
No, I think this is correct. Yes. So, okay. But my point just about the medical case, which I just mentioned, the hospital case, is that there we have a couple of, let's say, fixed scenarios in a way.
Yeah.
So we can sort of predetermine this fixed set of things. But in some cases, we have, like, let's say, in the general case where you're looking around for literature, it's very difficult to know why somebody's asking or something.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to go. In the meantime, a few more questions came in. I'm going to go through them one at a time. Will the slides be available online? I'll pick that up with the organizers, but this is an open meeting, so I hope we can also share the slides for all of the four talks. Corina mentions another example of a thing that's related to your contextual task-based QA setting. Then you asks, refers back to the reviewer recommendation context that you mentioned, Michael. What would happen now if the topic of a paper is quite new and niche? How would you find your reviewers? Yeah.
Right. So I think at the moment, so this we didn't specifically look into this. I can just sort of say what I think is currently happening, or what I currently expect. And this is a bit related to the previous presentation as well. It's basically sort of the quality of service in a way. So if you are currently submitting something which is new and niche, I think you will get actually, or you not directly, but you will get less qualified reviewers in the end. The reason for this is that the current recommendation system just doesn't properly isn't properly able to see where your niche topic really fits. So it will just have less training on this kind it sort of has a very large bias. Let's put it like that, and it's trained on certain examples. And so if you come up with something new and niche, this current recommender will not properly recommend people for this. Yeah. But I think I'm not sure that this is a problem which we can immediately solve, right? Because of course this is also a bit of a cold start problem. If you haven't seen a topic ever, then it might just be also impossible to find any reviewers for it.
Okay, thank you. Mert has a question about the structure of the GraphDB, or schema to be exact. Is that flexible? Is it fixed? Do you use schema.org? So can you share some insights there, Michael?
I can share something partially at least. So some of them are quite Elsevier proprietary, but I can say that it's sort of a mix between the two. So basically, there is a partial fixed schema, and then there are flexible parts which can be put on top. Let me put it like this. So this is not unlike schema.org, right? In schema.org, you can also use their fixed schema and then also define your own terminology on top. And basically, this is also happening internally in Elsevier. So the organization is so large, there are so many different products and sources of information that you can imagine that internally inside Elsevier, the same is happening as what is happening sort of on a global scale with schema.org. Right? So there is a need to fix something so that things are more interoperable, but then you will have flexibility on the lower granularity. Okay,
makes sense. Thanks.
And then maybe one more thing I can say. So schema.org is not used directly, but they have their own internal vocabularies for all kind of things.
Okay. There's a suggestion here by TX relating to their earlier question, and the suggestion is to ask how come questions, because that might help people think about the process.
Right. So I'm assuming that this is related to the start-based question answering, right? So so there is really a point that this might be really more of an interactive system, right? So it's not such that you type one question and then you try to guess what's going on as an answering system. It might be just a really like an interaction where you ask more like sort of why are you asking, or what is going on, and so on.
Okay. Yeah, and in that emergency room setting, I guess you would have some clear-cut classes for users to select from in a much more open-ended setting, maybe also with far less data available. Previous interactions.
Yeah, it's also very much related to your earlier comment, Martin, about sort of the risk assessment, right? So if we have the emergency room, we don't want to make mistakes at that point. If we have just a search box on, let's say, the Elsevier homepage, and you search, or let's say some Scopus search, and you search for something, if we make a mistake about your intention, nothing bad is going to happen, right? So you might just not find the papers which you're looking for immediately. You might just find them later with some different keywords, but nothing will break, basically. In the emergency room, we want to exactly know what people are looking for, and want to know what's going on.
Okay. In the meantime, the question about sharing of presentations has also been answered by NROs, so they'll be added to the YouTube channel, hopefully within a week or so. So thank you, Michael, for the presentation, for the plans. We've been running for a bit over a year now, so I guess on the website of the lab, people in the audience who are interested in finding out more can also find some of the papers produced by lab members.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Yep. Bye.